Okay, so part two of lecture, or video lecture two for week two. I'm going to actually go to the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, and we will get to changes that we see with women as we get closer to the Revolution. So the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Now, this dawned in the late 17th century. It gave rise to new ideas which would dramatically change the way people viewed politics, society, economics, culture, and science. The Protestant Reformation helped to break down the shackles of superstition and helped to open the door to the rise of science and to the challenge of the church. Now, the Protestant Reformation, huge event. I would argue it's the most important event of the last 500 years. We won't really get into it in depth here, but one thing to say when I say the church, at this time we're talking about the Catholic Church. So when you just say the church, it means Catholicism. Because the Catholic Church was the only church, the only Christian church really up until the Protestant Reformation. You have some orthodoxies, but the Catholic Church was known as, quote unquote, the church. And the Protestant Reformation challenged the church. It challenged authority in a way that nothing really had before. So, again, we have the rise of science, the age of reason, and one of the changes we see with the Enlightenment, God and the church are no longer the sole source of knowledge. The secular replaced the sacred in many ways. People search for knowledge and information in different ways. And as you can imagine, this would it would open up a whole new universe to scholars, to academics, to students. Now, some of the basic ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment. The universe is fundamentally rational and governed by natural laws. This leads to natural rights, which of course are key to the Declaration of Independence. Human history is the history of progress. People improve themselves through knowledge, and society can be perfected. We see a trust in science, a belief in the goodness of human nature, the sense that human behavior and societies can be understood and manipulated like the natural world. This is very important to the Enlightenment. Again, very important to how we will see Western society in general evolve over the next few centuries. And one last thing, and certainly not least, the idea of free will. Those who supported, or the Enlightenment thinkers, the philosophers, believed that we control our own destiny. Now, obviously, this is integral to any kind of democratic concept, right? Because if everything is predestined, the people don't need the right to vote, they just allow the royalty. But if people do control their own destinies, then they should have a say in those destinies. And so that's what we see with this idea of free will. Now, what are some of the implications of Enlightenment thinking? There's positive and negative. From the Enlightenment, the rise of the modern nation state comes. Now, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, one which was really derived from their sense of order. And their burgeoning sense of nationalism. Napoleon would really perfect this later. We also see the origin of true representative governments. Now, certainly these existed in ancient Rome and Greece in some ways, but the representative nature of these republics, beginning with the American experiment, was something wholly different. One which truly embraced the voice, beliefs, and decisions of the masses, and not simply the landed gentry, the clergy, or the royalty. The concept of equality also develops, as do vestiges of capitalism and imperialism. These would grow substantially over the next century, but the seeds were sown by Enlightenment thinkers. Again, many of the founders, many Western idealists were the ones who put these ideas then into practice. One unfortunate implication from the Enlightenment is the creation of a race as a way to classify human beings, and concomitantly then the rise of racism. Enlightenment thinkers focused on the order of nature and classified people as they did other parts of nature. Racial principles were used to rank and distinguish groups of humans hierarchically. Phrenology, the idea that one's intelligence is defined by the size of one's brain, came from this mindset. Yes, scientists actually believe that the size of one's brain determined one's intelligence. Later, some of these classifications would be used to justify the ideas of social Darwinism, of colonization and imperialism, and ultimately of eugenics. People like Margaret Sanger and another infamous person from the 20th century, Adolf Hitler. People are inherently different, so the thought went. Some are stronger and smarter and thus will survive. Those who are weaker and lack intelligence will perish sooner than not. Thus, the smarter and stronger people should try to provide uplift to the weak. This justified colonization of other people, direct rule over them, whether acquiesced to or not, and in some cases the elimination of those who were inferior, again, eugenics. Now, to be sure, these latter ideas were not those of the philosophers. These were not Enlightenment ideals, but there is a connection between the two. The logical outcome of the focus on classification led to justification by many of these types of views. So again, these are not Enlightenment ideas, but they're a natural outcome of them. So let's get to the First Great Awakening, another major event that we see in the United States. As has been discussed already, religion would play an important role in America's development during the early settlement as well as prior to the Revolution, which we're going to touch upon. The Great Awakening is one such example. This week you will read about the Enlightenment. Now, not all were enamored of this rise of science, the age of reason, and views such as heliocentrism that challenged religious authority. A religious revival swept through the colonies during the 1730s, which served as something of a reaction to this age of reason. Religious leaders such as Jonathan Edwards believed that New Englanders were becoming too focused on worldly matters, that their pursuit of riches had overtaken the Calvinist goals set forth. Additionally, they were beginning to question the very foundations of Calvinism, for example, believing that predestination may not be correct and that good works actually could save one's soul. Ministers turned angry and argued that an angry God would show little mercy on human sinners. Thus, we see the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This would be Edwards' most famous sermon and a reading requirement in many literature classes. If you have not read it, I highly recommend you do. It tells you a lot about what religious thought was at the time. Now, a schism would develop within American Protestantism as the New Light, or Awakening, preachers set up their own schools and churches, while Old Light ministers retained a more traditional sense of worship. Evangelicalism developed from the former group, emphasizing the primacy of emotions and enthusiasm during religious worship. Old Lights would downplay the emotional aspect and emphasize a more rational process. These were not insignificant differences, and they helped to foster some of the religious diversity, really, that we enjoy today. The names are somewhat misleading, though. The Old Lights represented what Calvinism or Puritanism had morphed into. Again, the Awakening. They had morphed into after roughly 100 years in the New World. As mentioned, they believed in good works and that good works could earn one's salvation. This was antithetical to true Puritanism. Old Lights had also developed the idea of the halfway covenant to combat a declining membership, which allowed for those who were baptized and the children of those who had shown salvation to be included in the church, but without full membership. Thus, even those who were not saved, who had not achieved grace, were eligible for church membership. Again, this is a huge change from what would happen before. The Old Lights were those who Edwards had considered sinners because of their materialism, an issue which harkened back to the earliest days of Massachusetts Bay Colony, when ministers such as John Cotton warned against worldliness and materialism. The New Lights, on the contrary, espoused these ideas of the earliest Puritan settlers: predestination, grace through faith alone, avoidance of materialism and worldly status. Thus, the New Lights represented, older traditional Puritanism, and Old Lights represented the newer transformed Puritanism. Aside from these religious specifics, though, the Great Awakening did impact the development of the colonies on the road toward revolution. A sense of egalitarianism developed as many New Light preachers were not ordained. This was a sharp contrast to previous eras when ministers were not only ordained but considered an upper class of sorts. And again, this was key to the Reformation. This was part of what drove Luther, Calvin, Hus, all those folks, this idea that the clergy was considered an upper class. They were considered the highest class in society, and so they received all kinds of benefits and privileges. Thus, with this idea, New Light ministers, again, do not have to go through this training. The deference to one's betters was no longer relevant. The very idea of congregationalism, which reflected the earliest Puritan churches in New England, was democratic in nature as well, as power was decentralized because there was no way of conducting affairs, but each congregation organized and practiced as it saw fit. Each congregation in Congregationalism was independent, unlike the Catholic Church or even the Church of England. And this is important. Again, this reflects much of what we see with American government. Once the Constitutional Convention is finalized, we see this decentralized nature of authority. The idea that for example, the Articles of Confederation, that each state owns its own destiny, and the whole is then rendered less powerful. So Congregationalists, again, each congregation is independent. There is no centralized authority. This also contrasts what we see in the Catholic Church, and again, one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation itself. Now, these churches also refused to bow to the Church of England, further cementing their independence from the Old World and garnering more freedom to act as they saw fit. And even though the Great Awakening and its changing nature may not have been embraced by all, it was a national movement, further reflecting a growing sense of togetherness among the colonies. So, just to brief things down here, dissent was an American staple even prior to the Revolution. The Great Awakening, again, very much encouraged this, as did the Enlightenment. There was significant unrest even in the 17th century, mostly relating to the power of the crown and its appointments. The ups and downs of English leadership would also play a role. Cromwell's revolution, the reestablishment of the Stuarts, the Glorious Revolution, a lot of change was going on in England, which led to instability in the colonies. And of course, religion would play a key role. Political power also contributed. So this is where you kind of see some of these connections to the revolution, which we will get into more in depth next week.